Two of today's singers have a direct relationship with today's first topic. Eugene Stratton was one of the great stars of the music halls of 100 years ago, not least on the stage of Belfast's Alhambra Theatre.
It's the same old tale of the palpitate and nigger every time. Yes, every time. It's the same old trouble of the cold that once told in our very soul. It's the same old heart that is longing for its lady every time. Yes, every time. But not the same gal, not the same gal. She is my lily, my lily, my lily gal. She goes every sundown, yes, every sundown, calling in the cattle of the mountain. I go, hey, she wants me, yes, hey, she wants me, help her do the calling and the counting. She plays her music to the lowlands that roam above. But I'm the black sheep and I'm waiting for the signal of my little lady love. She's my lady love, she is my dove, my baby love. She's no gal for sitting down to dream, she's the only queen Laguna Dome. I know she likes me, I know she likes me. Hey, she said so. She is the lily of Laguna. She is my lily and my rose.
Well, that was Eugene Stratton singing Lily of Laguna, and that was a song, of course, sung by a man who was top of the bill at the Alhambra and who knew Willie John Ashcroft very well. Now, it might seem rather surprising to be introducing, or using that music to introduce an item about Belfast City Cemetery, but Jim O'Hagan can explain the connection. Jim, what is the connection there?
Well, Walter, the connection is that Eugene Stratton was top of the bill for many years at the Alhambra Theatre when Willie John Ashcroft owned the theatre. Willie John Ashcroft was born in 1843 in Rhode Island in the United States of America. He had Irish parents. When he was young, he was a sort of a child prodigy, and he travelled all over the United States of America with his own troupe of dancers and singers. In 1870, he came to Great Britain, and as part of his tour, he intended to come to Belfast for 12 nights. In those days, the Alhambra was owned by a man called Dan Lowry. It had previously been a public house. But Ashcroft came for 12 nights in the 1870s, and he stayed until 1918. And in that time, he introduced many, many favourite artists that became world entertainers. People like Charlie Chaplin, Vesta Tilley, G.H. Eliot, Charles Coburn, Dan Leno, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, Eugene Stratton. He was a lovable character, Willie John. And the thing about the Alhambra was that it could get a bit bawdy at times. And people used to say that if you came out of it on a Saturday night and you hadn't got a black eye, then you had missed something really important. You see, the problem with the Alhambra was that Willie John's wife, Kitty Burke, always suspected Willie John of having an eye for the ladies. So there were many scenes that took place that in reality were real scenes of her being annoyed with him. But in fact, that the audience thought that it was part of a theatrical sketch. She would come up the middle aisle of the theatre, and one evening she threw a frying pan at him, hit poor Willie John in the head, and he got an enormous bump. Of course, the crowd loved all this sort of thing. They loved it. It was real live entertainment for them. As well as that, he made a lot of money. Now, it was estimated that at the height of his popularity in Belfast, they were making £100 clear profit a week, which for the 1880s was some money. And that was also £40. They made also £40 clear profit in the bar. Willie John, of course, was a great dancer. He was a good flautist. He was a very good violinist. And I remember my grandfather telling me of him going to the Alhambra way back in the 1890s. And he would see Willie John, and he'd be dressed in a tall black frock coat with a castor hat. And of course, he was always introduced as Mr. Ashcroft. There was no such a thing as introducing him as Willie John. I suppose the nearest we could get to him today would be the rather lovable character Leonard Sachs, who introduced a program called The Good Old Days back some years ago. Now, as I said before, Kitty and him fought the peace out, and yet she only lived about 18 months after him, and she's buried up in the city cemetery alongside him. She died in 1920, he died in 1918.
Now that's the point really that we're talking about today. Your interest in the city cemetery, Belfast City Cemetery, you've made a considerable study of it, and you found that there are a lot of very interesting people buried there. Where did this interest come from?
Well, Walter, I'm a school teacher, and I work in St. Kevin's, which is just adjacent to the city cemetery. And some years ago, I just used to slip out at lunchtime across the road and just to meander and walk through the cemetery as part of my lunch hour. And I came across all these interesting graves with a lot of the history of the people on the stones. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be lovely if I collated a lot of these stories and then went back and did a bit further work on them? And that's what I did.
So there are a lot of famous people.
Very many so, indeed very many.
And what is rather different from the situation today is that originally, of course, many of the most famous citizens of Belfast would have ended at the city cemetery.
That's right. I'm thinking of people like W.J. Perry, who owned the Belfast shipyard. Perry was he really was, I suppose, a tycoon. He was one of the first modern tycoons. And he was born in Canada in the year 1847. But he was brought to Conleague in County Down as a very small boy. And he grew up in Conleague, County Down. Subsequently to that, he entered Harland and Wolff as an apprentice at the age of 15. But he showed such a lot of business acumen that Sir Edward Harland brought him in to help him run the firm, and he took him into partnership in 1874. And from then, of course, he went on from strength to strength, because Harland had, with his interest in local politics, Harland indeed had virtually retired from the running of the shipyard in the 1880s. And of course Wolff as well. He had been a partner as well, but he again got into central government. He became MP for East Belfast, and again he showed a lack of interest in continuing in the firm. So Perry actually was the main driving force. When we think of the shipyard today, we would think of Perry, and he's very often a neglected figure, a man of great wealth and great influence, a man who, interestingly enough, despite his yard men being unionist to a man, Perry was a home ruler in politics, and indeed he suffered a lot for this. There's a lovely story in the 1906 election to West Belfast. Perry got so disillusioned with unionism that he put up an independent unionist candidate who really was a liberal, and Perry was a liberal. And what happened was that Joseph Devlin, the nationalist, only got the seat by 16 votes. So you can see, if Perry's unionist hadn't been there, the unionists themselves would have won the seat. So that rankled with the unionist establishment. But again, he was, as I said, he was a man of great wealth. He owned a wonderful house in London. He owned a steam yacht, the Valiant, which Pierpont Morgan said that to think of owning one, you had to have the money before you even thought of owning one, because it was so expensive to run. In 1896, he brought the Marquis of Dufferin and Ava back from his diplomatic career in Canada, and he chartered a boat. and it cost something like £5,000 for the weekend to just take him and his boat right from London up to Belfast.
That was a lot of money then.
Oh, terrific, a terrific amount of money. He became a baron whenever the Liberal government got in 1906, and he became a Viscount in 1921. And in between, of course, he was the man who indeed was the owner of the shipyard whenever the Titanic was sunk. But the thing about that was that he, in fact, was due to go on the Titanic on its maiden voyage. He wasn't able to go due to illness, because, you see, Perry indeed had travelled on his ships. He used to travel and mingle with a lot of the people.
So if he hadn't been ill, he would definitely have been on board the Titanic.
He would have been very much so on board the Titanic, and it is said that he never really got over the shock of the Titanic going down. He said whilst he didn't lose financially, he felt he lost a lot of prestige by that.
Are some of these graves then very elaborate if they are the graves of very famous and very wealthy people?
Yes, they are indeed. You can see that actually if you do a tour around the cemetery. And again, of course, some of them have all the high flown and their grandiloquence of the Victorian era. You would always imagine that the people were wonderful people. Their virtues were writ large on the stones. And you go round, and if you go round with a knowledgeable person, they will say, "Oh, that fellow, he wasn't as good as all that."
And of course, a lot of the industry of the area is represented too, isn't there?
Yes, you would get the various mill owners of the local area would be buried there. You have, for instance, one interesting grave is Thomas Gallagher, who owned Gallagher's cigarette manufacturing concern. Again, a very most interesting character. He came to Belfast in 1863, but he didn't start cigarette manufacturing until 1902. Gallagher was also the chairman of the Belfast Steamship Company, and he's very, very much involved with the 1907 dock strike. And there's a lovely story about that, in that became a very bitter and acrimonious dispute between the Belfast carters, the dockers, and the employers. And Big Jim Larkin, who would be well known in Irish history as a trade union activist, he was very much involved with Gallagher in negotiations. And he said one time, someone asked him, "Mr. Larkin, what are your memories of Gallagher?" "Well," he said, "you've all heard of St. Patrick banishing the snakes from Ireland." Well, he said, the thing is, he forgot one, and that one was Thomas Gallagher.
Quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Indeed it is, Walter. It's very much. Again, surprisingly, a lot of the men that you'll find buried there, the industrialists and the politicians, they have been ennobled. But Gallagher doesn't seem to have been ennobled. You will find that one of the facets of my research is, why would one person get ennobled and why would another not? I mean, the case would be also for W.H. McLaughlin of the famous Belfast McLaughlin and Harvey building firm, who did an awful lot of philanthropic work in Belfast. He remodelled the Victoria Memorial Hall in Belfast. He gave a lot of money to the Royal Victoria Hospital. Yet we find his son, who was director of recruiting for the British forces during the 1914-18 war in Ireland, was ennobled. He became a Sir, and his father never did. So, you see, you can see the wheeling and dealing that went on in a lot of cases.
Would you say that there are a lot of stories associated with some of those who are buried in Belfast City Cemetery?
Oh, quite a lot of them. One of the most interesting stories doesn't really concern a character as such, but a controversy on the original burial rites of the cemetery vis-a-vis Catholics and Protestants. When the cemetery was opened in 1869, it was envisaged that there was 1/3 of it was to be reserved for Catholic burials. That was 15 acres. and the other 30 acres was to be reserved for the Protestant citizens of Belfast. That was fine, but the first objection was raised by the Bishop of Down and Connor, Dr. Dorian. He said that there would have to be a wall built, and this wall is in the cemetery until this day. It's a 9-foot sunken wall with a 6-foot trench, and this was intended to go right up the cemetery, right from top to bottom of the cemetery. But, of course, with the controversy that arose, and it was extremely acrimonious, it never really got fully built, and there's now today just about 100 yards of it, but you can walk across it. You may well wonder, what was the nub of that dispute? Well, the nub of the dispute was that Bishop Dorian was insisting that only people that he felt were Catholics were entitled to be buried in the cemetery, whereas the City Council said that any person who felt they were a Catholic were entitled. And again, of course, Dorian felt that he was being hard done by, in the sense that the 15 acres he and his co-religionists were getting was not part of the original ornamental design of the cemetery. And so he backed off. But before that, the dispute actually went to the Irish Privy Council in Dublin, and none other than Isaac Butt appeared for Dorian. The Privy Council, they decided to halt the proceedings and to in other words, to sort of say to the both sides, cool off, can you not have a compromise? But meanwhile, Dorian backed off completely and bought a plot of land, 15 acres, on the other side of the road, and that's where the present Milltown Cemetery was created, from that 15 acres on the other side of the road.
But when you talk about the differences then between Protestants and Catholics in the Belfast City Cemetery, it wasn't only Christians who were buried there.
Oh, no, indeed. In fact, in 1871, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland gave permission for a Jewish cemetery to be erected within the grounds of the city cemetery. And again, there's a wonderful little Jewish cemetery today, which is in the grounds. Again, it is walled round, and there are quite a number of interesting monuments there. One of the facets of the monuments you will find there would be, they are all dated back to creation itself, the beginning of creation, Abraham. And so you will get people buried, and they will have a year like 5,643 or whatever. There's also some very interesting stars of David on the stones as well. Now, in recent years, the Jewish people have tended to bury at Carnmoney. They don't tend to bury nowadays, although one of the most interesting monuments in the whole of the cemetery is situated in the Jewish part of the cemetery, and that was Sir Daniel Joseph Jaffa. And you may well remember, Walter, that there used to be a Jaffa Memorial Fountain down in Victoria Square. That was erected in memory of Mr. Jaffa. It is now in the sad position up at the top of the Botanical Gardens in Belfast. But Daniel Joseph Jaffa did an awful lot for the citizens of Belfast, and that is why there was a memorial fountain erected to him. He provided the money for the first synagogue in Belfast, which was opened in 1871. He died in 1874, and of course his son, Sir Otto Jaffa, he became even more famous than his father, in that he was a great philanthropist in Belfast, and indeed a school is now called after him, the Jaffe School, because he did an awful lot for technical education in Belfast. He was Lord Mayor a number of times.
Have you found it an interesting subject to look at the cemetery and to do a bit of research? I know that you're writing about it at the moment, aren't you?
That is quite right. I have a brochure prepared which the City Council have at the moment in its possession, and they are planning to produce this brochure so that it can be distributed to the general public to create an awareness of the place, because it is one of Belfast's most historical sites. There's tremendous heritage to the place, and thanks to people like the Friends of the Belfast City Cemetery, people like Mr. Reginald Maxwell, and people like Mr. Alan Jones. These folk have in recent years attempted to recreate and to revamp the cemetery and bring it back to its former glory.
Had it suffered very much?
Oh, very, very much so. For instance, in the 1980s, the beautiful chapel was burnt down, and that again was just some vandals got in at night. The beautiful chapel had a great history. It was built in 1874 by a Mr. Samuel McClure. And you may wonder why there's a chapel in the cemetery. Well, in those days the tradition was not to have funeral services in parish churches, but the funeral service was always carried out in the cemetery. So the remains would be brought into the cemetery and into the chapel, and the service would be held there. So this was the custom indeed for many years. But then, of course, with the burning down of the chapel, that was lost, and what we just have now is just a spire left. But the Friends of the City Cemetery, they're hoping to renovate a lot of the monuments and that, and they have cleaned it up tremendously.
So many of the graves are in good condition, and the headstones.
Splendid. Yeah. They're splendid condition. I mean, it's most interesting. I have a pamphlet on the price of graves, and in 1885, the price of a vault was £12 10 shillings, and the price of the cheapest grave was £1, and it cost you 10 shillings and 7 and 6 to open graves. And there's quite a difference in price then than now to do that sort of thing.
It's a little bit of a coincidence, Jim, that we're talking about this now, because I was in Paris recently, and I've been recommended to go to see a very historic graveyard there, where a lot of very famous people are buried. Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, Chopin, people like that. And what interested me is that today, some of those graves, thinking particularly of the grave of Chopin, there are fresh flowers, and somebody's obviously coming there on a very regular basis and putting flowers on some of those graves. Would you find that in Belfast City Cemetery?
Not particularly. You wouldn't actually find that, although I have found it, funnily enough. I was on a visit to London last year at Brompton Cemetery, and again I visited the grave of Richard Tarber, and that was happening in his grave. Every day, apparently, some different person always comes, and they scribble little messages on the grave as if the man had never died and he was still alive. But we wouldn't find it so much today. But at least today, mostly today, it's the Catholic people of Belfast who are burying in the cemetery, and perhaps if tensions will cease, if tensions will abate in Belfast, we will get the Protestant people coming back, because according to this Belfast Cemetery authorities, there's still burial space for 100 years in the cemetery, and there's space for the new grave space is still 7 or 8 years. So there's still plenty of burial space in the place.
Do people like to come to visit cemeteries?
I would say yes. I found since I started this little bit of research, I suppose you could call, some people took a funny view. They would say to me, "Oh, Jim, that's a most morbid type of fascination you have." But I would find since I started my work in the Belfast City Cemetery that indeed lots and lots of people actually would be interested. In fact, we have done some tours in the cemetery, and indeed we would get maybe a couple of hundred people would follow us round. And so it is very rewarding. It's a most tranquil place to go to. A most tranquil place.
I'm in the spell of your charm divine, dressed like a queen with light so gay. You are the love of my heart today. Mine, laughter and music and stars that shine. Wonderful city where I belong. To you I sing my song. My heart seems to beat with rapture so sweet. I walk through the town in a trance. A lady so fair, beyond all compare, has filled me with joy and romance. keep changing so quickly each day. No wonder I dream a beauty supreme enslaves me, and I must obey. And though she has countless lovers like me, I have no wish to be set free. By the end of mine, I'm in the spell of your song divine, dressed like a queen with life so gay. You are the love of my heart today. At the end of mine, laughter and music and stars and shine. Wonderful city where I belong. Oh, yeah, I sing my
Richard Tauber, though he died and was buried in London, is most often associated with Vienna, the city he loved the most. And Jim O'Hagan was talking about his interest in Belfast City Cemetery. Jim will be back again shortly with some portraits of famous Belfast citizens. But a few days ago, I was given an introduction